Welcome back, Algebra 1. So today we're going to talk about the quadratic formula. This is probably one of my favorite lessons, and I have a feeling you may like this too. It's a lot simpler than using the umbrella method. It doesn't allow us to find the equation in a simplified form, but it allows us to find the solutions to these polynomials that we've been looking at. So make sure you have this in your table of contents, and then let's go ahead and get started with the warm-up. All right, here's your warm-up. Pause the video, take about 10 minutes to try and figure out number 3 and 4. It says 3 and 4 because we already did 1 and 2 in the previous lesson, so I just split up the warm-up into 2 parts. Let's take a look at how you did. So number 3 is a review of the previous lesson. Remember, we learned that the opposite of a square is a square root. What we need to do first is isolate that variable. How we do that is inverse operations. Negative 2 is on the wrong side, so I want to make that move to the right side by adding it. That's the inverse of minus 2. That would give me 2x squared equals 18. Then I want to get rid of the coefficient 2. The opposite of multiplication is division, so I'm going to divide 2. And then I'm left with x squared equals 9. Lastly, the opposite of x squared is the square root. So I square root both sides to balance the equation, and I have x equals plus or minus 3. The square root of 9 is 3. If you wrote 3 and negative 3, that's fine too. Number 4, we have 3 in the front of the parentheses, which means I'd probably distribute. So we're not going to do that here because that's going to leave me with a whole mess. What I'm going to do instead is get rid of it by doing the opposite. The opposite of multiplying is what I do in distribution, is dividing. Divide both sides by 3. Hopefully you know that 48 divided by 3 gives you 16. So now I have x plus 3. X plus 4 squared equals 16. Now, I need to get rid of that squared. The opposite of square is square root. So I'm going to square root both sides of the equation. Then I'm left with x plus 4, you no longer need the parentheses, equals plus or minus, since I'm square rooting, and that gives me 4. Remember, in this type of situation, you need to set up 2 separate problems. One that says x plus 4 equals 4, and one that says x plus 4 equals negative 4. That's what this stands for. There's 2 separate solutions. Then use inverse operations in order to solve. So minus 4, that would give me x equals 0. Minus 4, that would give me x equals negative 8. Those are my 2 solutions for this problem. So hopefully you did well on those. Let's take a look at this quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula is the following. Make sure you write this down in your notes. The quadratic formula is used in order to find the solution to a polynomial. It must be a trinomial that is written in the standard form ax squared plus bx plus c. And we put equals 0 because we're solving for the solutions of x. Think about it this way. It's the intercepts if y is 0. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now you may feel a little overwhelmed, but you're going to love it, I promise you. Each of these letters corresponds to a letter in the quadratic formula. So when you have a polynomial, you can substitute those numbers, those coefficients and the numbers into the equation, and it'll allow you to find the solution. The quadratic formula is very important as you progress in mathematics. So one way that I want you to remember this is the story about a negative boy. The negative boy is a story of stories of all time. The story involves Xavier. Xavier was a negative boy. Xavier couldn't decide if he wanted to go to the radical party, so he decided to be squared and missed out on 4 awesome chicks. The party was over at 2 a.m. So again here, there was a boy named Xavier, that's an X, equals a negative boy couldn't decide plus minus to go to the radical party, so he decided to be squared and missed out on 4 awesome chicks. The party was over at 2 a.m. Hopefully your parents aren't listening, but that's just one way to remember it. There's other ways that you can remember the quadratic formula. Just do a simple Google search on mnemonics for remembering quadratic formula, and there's lots of fun stories out there. So let's get after it. How do I use this quadratic formula? Well, if we go back to our example here, the quadratic formula is solved using a number of steps. As you get more familiar, you'll be able to skip some of these steps. In the following problem, our first example here, just follow along and listen as I go over how to manipulate the quadratic formula. You have x squared plus 12x plus 32 equals 0. So there's my trinomial that I'm trying to solve here. Then you can see that a is identified as 1, b is identified as 12, and c is identified as 32. Then you substitute those values into the quadratic formula. So you can see here, step 1 was to rewrite the formula. Step 2, substitute the values into the formula. So wherever there's an A, you put 1. Wherever there's a B, you put 12. Wherever there's a C, you put 32. And then evaluate. So when they evaluated, 12 squared was 144, and then they did 4 times A times C to get 128. So I'll break that down for you in a further example, but you're welcome to skip those steps. And then 2 times 1 gave them 2, so that's why they just wrote 2. Now I'm back up the top, so I'm simplifying here. They had 144 minus 128. So if you evaluate 144 minus 128, you get 16, right? Then if I do the square root of 16, I get 4. So this is where this random 4 comes from. Remember, plus minus, you have to write the problem twice. So that's why there's 2 equal signs on the top right here. That green negative 12 still stays. Nothing has changed about it. So now if I'm evaluating negative 12 plus 4 gives me negative 8, and then negative 8 divided by 2 gives you negative 4. On the other side, you have a minus 4. So this time you have negative 12 minus 4, which gives you negative 16. Negative 16 divided by negative 16 divided by 2 is negative 8. Okay? Then you have your solutions. So let me write this in a way for you so that you can see all of the steps. I'll try to go through in as much detail as possible, and then you can speed up the video or skip through if you don't need any further examples broken down. So the first example here I'm going to do is x squared minus 4x plus 3 equals 0. So this is our example 1. Make sure you're writing this down with me. I'm going to identify A, B, and C. A equals 1 because there's no number in front of x, we know it's 1. B equals negative 4. And C equals 3. A, B, and C are important because remember in our quadratic formula, you have A, B, and C, and those are where you substitute the numbers in for. Okay, so step 1, you want to rewrite the formula. Okay, remember the story about the negative boy. Xavier was a negative boy who couldn't decide if he wanted to go to the radical party, so he decided to B squared and missed out on 4 awesome chicks. The party was over at 2 a.m. Okay, then I just substitute A, B, and C to where they go. So step 2, substitute A, B, and C. Remember that's standard form. So if you need to go back a couple lessons and look for standard form, that's where this ABC comes from. A, B, and C, it's written standard form. Those are what the letters stand for. So substitute A, B, and C for the values from the problem. Okay, so I know A is 1, B is negative 4, and C is 3. So I have X equals, B is negative 4, but also in the formula, you see how there's a negative right there? So I have to write B in parentheses. So that first negative is part of the formula. Now the second one is attached to the negative 4. Hopefully you know what's going to happen next with those double negatives. My plus minus and my radical symbol, b squared again, I'm going to write it in parentheses since it's negative, negative 4 squared. Then minus 4, and then A is 1, and C is 3. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and extend this all the way to the end. You don't want to shorten it. Now, everything, even from this very beginning, this is a long division sign. Everything is divided by 2 times A, which is 1. Okay, so there I substituted all of the values A, B, and C into where they go into the quadratic formula. Step 3 will be to simplify. So I'm going to scroll up here. Step 3, simplify. And solve. Okay, simplify and solve. So you're trying to find those 2 values that will represent my x-intercepts here. In order to do that, I need to understand my basic math foundations. So for example, negative, negative, that 4 is going to turn into a positive. Plus or minus radical. Negative 4 squared, negative 4 times negative 4 is 16. Minus 4 times 1 times 3. So that's going to stay negative. 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times 3 is 12. All divided by 2 times 1, which is 2. Okay, then I want to keep going. So think of the radical as kind of like parentheses. We do PEMDAS first, right? So you want to simplify what's inside the radical before you do anything else. Otherwise, you're going to get messed up. So after you simplify everything that you can, then take a look at what's in the radical, see what can be simplified there. 4 plus or minus, what is 16? Take away 12, hopefully you know is 4. Divided by 2. Now I can see that the square root of 4 can also be simplified. So I have x equals 4 plus or minus 2 over 2. Remember, I want to break this apart into 2 separate problems because I have that plus minus. So x is going to equal 4 plus 2 over 2, or x equals 4 minus 2 over 2. Let me change that. And. Okay, these are both solutions. So then I just simplify. 4 plus 2 is 6, which is 3. And I have over here x equals 2 over 2, which is 1. So my 2 solutions would be 3 and 1. Now if I zoom out here, you can see all of the steps written. It is not that complex every time, just when we're first learning. Okay, so I have my formula up there in the yellow. X squared minus 4x plus 3 equals 0. Identify A, B, and C. Rewrite the formula. Substitute A, B, and C. Simplify and solve. So I'm sure as mathematicians you can figure out where to shortcut here, and feel free to do so as we go along. Okay, so now for example number 2. Example number 2. Okay. Example number 2, we're going to have, let me erase these so that we can't see them. Okay. Example number 2, we have 2x squared plus 3x minus 5 equals 0. So here's our ground zero. We're going to solve this magic little thing using the quadratic formula. Step 1, well, step 1A is A, B, and C, right? A is 2, B is 3, C is negative 5. Now step 1 is to write your formula. Xavier was a negative boy who couldn't decide if he wanted to go to the radical party, so he decided to B squared and missed out on 4 awesome chicks. The party was over at 2 a.m. Okay. Then step 2 was to substitute A, B, and C. Okay, so I know that I have my x equals negative b, so this time you see how b is positive, so that negative sign is part of the equation, but this time b is 3, so I don't need to write it in parentheses because it doesn't have an additional negative sign. Plus minus radical b squared, you can write it in parentheses, but you don't need to here because I'm not dealing with that extra negative, minus 4, a this time is 2, and c is negative 5. Make sure your radical is extended all the way past the c, and everything is a long division sign. Everything is divided by 2 times a. Okay? So then you know that step 3 is to simplify and solve. Okay? So when I simplify and solve, I just want to take it one number at a time, clean up any negatives, positives, squares, multiplication, all of that. So x equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 9. Now here's where this is going to be tricky. Let me break this down for you right here. Okay, so I have negative 4 times 2, which is a negative 8. But it's also times a negative 5, right? So I'm going to drop down that negative 5. Negative 8 times negative 5 is a positive 40. So when you're multiplying those three numbers together, think of like distribution. First do the negative 4 times whatever number's here. Negative 4 times 2 is negative 8. Then that number that you get, the result, multiply it by the third number here. Negative 8 times negative 5 is positive 40. Okay, so that would be the number that I write in that space. This would become plus 40. All divided by 2 times 2 is 4. Now remember, after you did all of that simplifying, adding, subtracting, squaring, and all that, do what's inside the radical. So in this case, I have 9 plus 40. 9 plus 40 is 49. All over 4. Now 49 has a perfect square. Plus or minus, whoopsies, plus or minus. Square root of 49 is 7. X equals negative 3 plus or minus 7. Now here's where you're going to take it into two parts. Oops, not yellow. X equals negative 3 plus 7 over 4. And x equals negative 3 minus 7 over 4. Okay? Then if you go ahead and simplify, you just figure out what that gives you. Sometimes it's an ugly number, sometimes it's a pretty number. If I can divide it by 4, that would be a pretty number. So in this case, I would have negative 3 plus 7, same signs add and keep, different signs subtract. That would give me 4, keep the sign of the higher number, positive 4 over 4. And over here I have x equals negative 3, negative 7. I'm going to add those together to get negative 10 over 4. Now on my left here I have x equals 1, but on my right I have a fraction. So I want to simplify that, or just keep it. Negative 10 over 4 is fine. If you also wrote negative 5 over 2, that would be right as well. Okay? Okay, now on to example number 3. Example number 3, we have 2x equals x squared minus 4. Now, if you're looking at this problem, you're like, what the heck is going on? This is not right. It looks different, right? Well, remember that whenever we learn something new, anything that we've previously learned is also applying. So everything else you've learned about these polynomial functions holds true in quadratic formula as well. Why I say that is because if we take a look at these previous two examples here, take a look here at this one, 2x squared plus 3x minus 5 equals 0. And if you take a look at this one here, is x squared minus 4x plus 3 equals 0. What was nice about our first two examples is that they were written in standard form. So this one differs in that it's not in standard form. In order to write it in standard form, I want to rearrange the formula so that everything's on the left and my right says x or says 0. That's because remember I'm trying to find the x-intercept when y is 0, and that technically would have a y right there if I was graphing it. Okay, we'll get into that another day. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to rearrange this so that x squared becomes in front over here because it's the highest power, and -4 I'm going to move right here behind the 2x. That way it's written in standard form. In order to do that, I need to do inverse operations. I just thought of another way I could have done this in less steps. You could also just move the 2x to go right in between, and that's the same thing, okay? I like things to be on my left versus my right, so to me it makes more sense to move this. It doesn't have a like term, so I'm just moving it to the other side. It's a positive 2x, so that's why I wrote plus, and then move my 4. It doesn't have any like terms, so I have -x squared plus 2x plus 4 equals nothing, 0. Okay, so now it's written in standard form, and this is what I'll be working with as I do my quadratic formula. So we had parts 1a, 1b, now we have a 1a1. So you need to first see that it's written in standard form so that you can identify a, b, and c. Okay, so let's work with this one here. I have a is -1, b is 2, and c is 4. Step 1, write the formula. So I have a boy named Xavier, look at my x, boy named Xavier was negative. He couldn't decide if he wanted to go to the radical party, so he decided to b squared and missed out on 4 awesome chicks. Party was over at 2 a.m. Okay, then step 2 is to substitute the value. So I have x equals, b in this case is 2 plus or minus the square root of 2 squared and minus 4. A is -1 and c is 4. All over 2 times a, which is -1. Okay, so then I'm going to do step 3, which is to simplify and solve. X equals -2 plus or minus the square root of 4. Oh boy, I've got a big problem here. So I'm going to work this out off to the side. I have -4 times -1, which is 4. That's also times 4, and 4 times 4 is 16. So this would be plus 16 here. Okay, all divided by -2. Then go ahead and simplify what's inside the radical. So I have x equals -2 plus or minus the square root of 20 all over -2. Now, if you're taking a look here, the square root of 20 does not have a perfect square, right? So because of that, for the purpose of this class, we will just keep this as our answer. Remember we talked about rational and irrational numbers? So the square root of 20 would be considered an irrational number because it doesn't have a square root. So when you have this situation, you can keep it in the radical. We can simplify, but that's a little advanced for this course, so we're just going to keep it like this. If you have an issue on HMH that it won't take your answer, just let me know, and I can adjust it for you. But that would be all, so go ahead and finish up your quizzes and HMH.